You're right, lads. This video is about comparing the Gamesir Cyclone 2 with the Tarantula Pro, also made by Gamesir. And I'm going to go into as much detail as I'm able to. So I'm going to get right to it with this one, with as little to no comedy as possible. Anyway, I do have separate reviews of these controllers, so if you're interested in learning more about them, then you can always watch those. First, we're going to start with how these controllers are similar to each other, and then we're going to move on to the differences. First and foremost, the controllers both use the same TMR tunneling magnetoresistance technology, and this is basically a slightly superior version of Hall effect sensors that you can find in other controllers, but it's a little bit more precise and it uses less power. Both controllers also have a 1000 Hz polling rate, by the way, which is a must for pro level gamers. In terms of the actual joystick feel, I'd say they almost feel the same as each other. Maybe the Cyclone 2 is ever so slightly lighter in feel, and I prefer the Tarantula just a little bit, but they're more similar than they are different. Next, it's the triggers. They're also very similar too in terms of the texture and overall feel. Both of them have a hair trigger mode as well, and they both have R4 and L4 buttons on the back. Both of these controllers are also multi-platform controllers, which means you can use them on PCs, Switch, Android, and iOS. And both controllers have additions that come with a charging stand, which houses your USB 2.4 GHz connection. Another thing is that both can be used with the Gamesir software that you'd install on your computer if you want to customize the controllers more. Both of these controllers also have a 6-axis gyroscope, which you might want to use if you play Switch games. And that is basically where the similarities end. Let's move on to the differences. Okay, so first up, the first button you'll be pressing on these controllers is the wake button. The wake button is actually a little bit larger on the Tarantula and is slightly more raised and pronounced. Next, you've got the ABXY buttons. There's a lot of differences here, so listen out. The most obvious is that the Tarantula can change configurations mechanically, which I'll show you now. And I think that's a really cool party trick actually. Then you've got the backlighting itself. The Tarantula has really nice and clear backlighting to its buttons, whereas the Cyclone doesn't have any backlighting. The Tarantula's buttons also feel more satisfying, at least in my opinion, when pressed. The Tarantula uses a cushioned membrane style switch for the ABXY buttons, whereas the Cyclone 2 has a micro switch button. The result is the Cyclone has a clickiness to it, and the Tarantula doesn't. The Tarantula feels more like the original Xbox ABXYs, if you know what I mean, whereas the Cyclone feels a little bit more like a mouse click. I prefer the Tarantula's approach, but it is personal tastes. When it comes to the backlighting of the controller, the Tarantula is much more basic in comparison. The Tarantula just gives you a strip of RGB backlighting under the center pad and a ring that goes around the wake button. The Cyclone backlighting is much more obvious and blingy. As for the D-pad, the Tarantula is a lot better. The diagonals are much easier to press and they're clickier on the Tarantula Pro. They also travel a lot less compared to the Cyclone 2. The Cyclone feels spongy and refined by comparison. Also notice the position of the D-pad. It's up higher on the Tarantula, and I think those of you who like playing fighting games probably prefer the D-pad in this position. I don't know, it never feels right to me when the D-pad is down low, unless the games that you play make minimal use of it, of course. Then you've got the M button. Both controllers have M buttons, but the one on the Cyclone 2 is small and it's at the front, whereas the one on the Tarantula Pro is larger and it's on the back. As for assignable buttons, in general, this goes to the Tarantula Pro all day and night. As you see here, you've got 4 buttons, C1, 2, 3 and 4 at the top. And another key difference is the Tarantula Pro has this center pad here, which is actually another 3 extra buttons, left, right and center. It's not a touchpad like a DualSense controller, by the way. I know it looks it, but it isn't. Anyway, the Cyclone 2 hasn't got any of these extra buttons at all. In total, with the Tarantula Pro, you get 9 mappable buttons, which means I think you could actually legitimately play some RPG games with the Tarantula controller if you wanted to. I haven't actually tried that, but I might now. Then you got the shoulder bumpers. I think the Tarantula Pro's bumper buttons are much better. They're denser and they feel a lot less hollow. They just feel better quality overall. As for the triggers, like I said earlier, they're mostly the same, but the Tarantula's triggers have an ever so slightly less travel to them, which I prefer as it feels a bit more natural in my hands. Also, when it comes to the hair trigger mode, the click is more tactile. Another difference is the Tarantula Pro does not have a 3.5mm headset jack, whereas the Cyclone 2 does. An interesting difference is that the Tarantula has these back buttons just like the Cyclone, but on the Tarantula they're in fact lockable, whereas on the Cyclone they're not. Bit of a shame, that one. Oh yeah, and another thing, when it comes to the hair trigger modes, what differentiates these two controllers is how you activate it. With the Tarantula Pro, there's a switch on the back, which is really easy to engage with. Whereas on the Cyclone 2, you have like a flicky toggle thing that's built into the trigger, and while it looks cool, it's a lot harder to actually engage the hair trigger mode and disengage it. I prefer the Tarantula on this point. When it comes to the color choices, the Tarantula Pro only comes in a black color, at least at time of making this video, whereas the Cyclone comes in black or white. And another key difference is the Tarantula is a more solid color design, whereas the Cyclone is a translucent design, which means when the lights are on at night, the Cyclone looks well impressive in it. As for the controller grips, the Tarantula feels a fraction grippier to me, and I find that overall better. Seeing as we're talking about grips, in terms of actually holding it, the Tarantula feels more anatomical to hold for your hands. You know, like the bulges in the grips just feel a little bit more natural. However, I've noticed on the wrists, the Cyclone keeps your wrists in a more neutral position. Watch carefully while I demonstrate it. When you're using a controller layout like the Tarantula, the wrists are in a slightly more flexed extension position and your index finger and thumb are slightly further apart. Now, I don't have wrist problems myself particularly, or repetitive strain injury, fortunately, so it doesn't bother me, but maybe, just maybe, the Cyclone design is a little bit more neutral and ergonomic, and someone out there is going to appreciate that point I just made. Another difference is the joysticks. Now, they look basically the same, but I find the Tarantula to be a little bit easier when you're actually clicking the joystick. You know, like the crouch button that you might use in certain games? The Cyclone feels a little bit wobblier to me, whereas the Tarantula feels more solid and bottoms out a little bit better. When it comes to battery life, well, the batteries themselves are markedly different in size. The Tarantula manages to cram a 1200 mAh battery in there, whereas the Cyclone manages 860 mAh. Maybe the Tarantula needs a little bit more battery to power those gears, but I'm not sure on the validity of that statement. My guess is that the Tarantula will last longer. Another difference for the Switch owners out there is that the Tarantula comes with an NFC connection. Now, I can't say that I will use this, but I have heard you do need this when it comes to specific Switch features, like connecting amiibos. I've personally never used that, and to be honest, I probably never will. But so far, as far as I'm aware, the Tarantula does have NFC and the Cyclone does not. The next thing to compare is the weight. Now, I'm going to weigh it now, so have a look on screen, but this doesn't tell you the whole story because sometimes how it feels in your hand is different. Now, the Tarantula weighs in at 20 or 30 grams heavier than the Cyclone 2. As expected. And for reference, just check the grammage of some other controllers. So I've got the Xbox Series X controller here, DualShock 4, and a wired GameCube controller. Bear in mind that the DualShock 4 and GameCube controllers are both lighter than the Cyclone 2. So the Cyclone 2 is by no means a light controller. The Xbox Series X controller does feel very hefty to me though, at near 300 grams. So I would say on average, the Tarantula and the Cyclone are actually in a good little sweet spot in terms of the grammage. And in terms of actual feel, I'd say the Tarantula does feel a little bit denser and heavier in the hand. But even though it feels a bit heavier, I prefer the weight distribution of the Tarantula. But that's just my personal preference. In reality, there's not really that much in it. Overall, I'm inclined to say I prefer the Tarantula Pro as it's more of an all-round controller with slightly better ergonomics, well, at least in my opinion. It also has more features and feels better thought out, and it has a higher quality feel and audible feedback when it comes to the switches. So I'd say the Tarantula is more for the type of person who wants a do-it-all kind of controller and for someone who wants the best quality feel. Whereas the Cyclone is more for a specific type of gamer who wants the experience to be high quality and as close to the Xbox controller experience as possible. The type of gamer who chooses the Cyclone 2 might only play a limited number of games and doesn't really care about all those extra buttons and features. Oh yeah, and the Cyclone looks bloody good at night, it does. Bosh.